Something I've been learning about lately is the difference between your ego and your intuition, highest self, soul, whatever you want to call it. And instead, we're going to talk about it. So, okay, I'm doing yoga teacher training right now, if you don't know that. So I've been learning a lot about the different areas of, mind, body, soul, and, really what it means to be mindful and to really connect with yourself, and how yoga is so much more than just a physical practice, but it's also a mental reality and all of this different type of stuff, right? And one of the things that I've been learning about recently, and I feel like I already knew it, and I've already maybe even talked about this on the podcast before. I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I know I have a blog post from way back when. And it's something that I, have always kind of been interested in the mind, body, soul, and the difference between them all, but also the difference between how do you differentiate ego from something else, I guess. And so that's what I have been kind of learning lately in yoga teacher training, and I wanted to talk about it because taking what I already knew and my own thoughts and what I'm learning right now and kind of cramming it all together to make some sort of idea framework that hopefully makes sense. So we have our mind, body, and soul, right? And I have always kind of been in the mindset that our body is, in a way, a bit of a limitation. Now, take this with a grain of salt, because I really used to struggle when I was a few years ago. I really used to struggle with it because I would always be like, hey, I really thought of my body as this limitation, and it's not something that should be thought of like, oh, it's this bad thing, right? Your body is what allows you to experience the world in an entire different way, right? And your soul is what is held within it. So your soul is you. Your soul is everything about you. And your mind and your body are what kind of help you experience that a little bit, right? So I think, and this is if you don't agree, that is okay type of thing. But something that we're really getting into the deep stuff here, but something that I really believe is those moments when you just feel so passionate, so in awe or grateful, gratitude, just oh my gosh, it's just life is just good, right? Or you just can't even hold yourself, you're just so happy, or things like that. That to me is the soul coming through. That to me is that thing where there's no other way to describe it except for that's the soul coming through, things like passions, what makes one person be passionate about something versus another person be passionate about something else, right? And I think that it's all mixed together with the mind and body. And I think that when we get that experience of just awe, or passion or excitement or anything, I feel like that is the mind and the body reacting to this moment that we almost touched our soul, if that makes any sense at all. But that's kind of how I've always felt about it. And I, even just looking at it from a neuroscience perspective, being in awe is so good for your brain, and being able to really connect with yourself is so good for your brain, because I do believe that is the purpose of our mind and our body, is to be able to live out our soul and experience things in different ways, right? Without your mind without your body, you wouldn't have your sense of touch. You wouldn't have your sense of smell. You wouldn't have all these different senses. And so it's a way for us to live. It's a way for our souls to experience this. I just hit my microphone, I'm sorry. It's a way for our souls to experience this life that we're in, right? That's my mindset. So with that, I've always thought of the body as a limitation in terms of when I was younger. I really thought of it as I always have been a huge thinker. I always have had just a million thoughts going on in my mind. And I have always felt really connected to, I guess, like, when I'm having a hard time, and I can't really do it now that I'm in St. Paul, whenever I go home or things like that, like I sit outside and I stare at the stars. And I've always just felt so connected to just looking up, because I realize this world is so big and there's something like so huge out there, right? And I don't really have a name for it, but there's, just connecting myself to the rest of this energy around the world. And that to me is the soul, and my mind had a big part in it because I've always been so connected to my mind. And yes, your mind can bring limitations too, because let me tell you, I've got a lot of rumination and stuff like that I go through, and so that the mind can be limiting as well, and the body can be limiting as well. The soul, I don't feel like that's ever limiting though. Like the soul is the ultimate, like when you are in connection with the soul, you're there. Like that's it. That is the best feeling. But the mind and the body can be these incredible ways for us to experience the world. And they can also have some sort of limitations, like the body can experience pain, the body can cause us to get so sidetracked from paying attention to the soul. The mind can do the same thing. I know that a lot because I ruminate a lot, all of these different things. And so, I've always just been such a big thinker that I guess I never really felt like my mind was limiting me too much, because I have gone through a lot of counseling in my lifetime, and I have the skills that I need, and I'm working on, constantly creating more, but I've always felt like I have resources when it comes to that. But my body, I just always felt like was somehow limiting me in a way of like, being like, I feel so in awe, and like, what can I do about it, like, my body's keeping me here on the earth when I just want to like float. I'm sounding ridiculous right now, I know, but this is something that I really struggled with, and it wasn't until a few years ago that I was really able to start looking at it in terms of, wait, maybe this body is actually a way for us to experience life in a whole other way. Like seriously, yeah, without my body, I wouldn't have my senses, like it is a resource, and we want to use it as that resource. We want to use it as a way to live out our souls. And that, to me, is where we get into this kind of ego conversation here. So our ego comes into play when we lose connection with the soul and we get too in tune with the mind and the body. And take it as you will. Again, this entire thing, like everything I say on the podcast as a whole, take it with a grain of salt. It doesn't need to be taken exactly to what I'm saying. You can disagree. That's okay. In fact, I want you to disagree. If you don't agree with me, like, that's okay, right? I want people to have their own thoughts. And yeah, but anyways, what I've been learning in yoga teacher training lately is that your ego is when you lose connection with your soul and become too in tune to, or like too focused on kind of like the material world and the like just everything here, and the mind and the body. And that's when things like our unconscious mind takes over in terms of the fight or flight response. And that's where the ego comes from. So think about it. Your ego is, think of that one person that you know of who has such a big ego, right? Like, I think we probably all like, I don't know, I can't even think of a specific person, but like, you know what I mean, right? Like, we all know what it feels like to have a big ego, right? And that's not necessarily what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ego here, but it is a good way to visualize it. And really what it is your ego is a flight or fight response. And it is a way that your body and your mind are trying to protect you. So when you're uncomfortable with something, when you're in pain, when you're, anything that your body can interpret as danger, you have this fight or flight response, this unconscious response, and that is your ego. And your ego does things like putting others down to make you feel better, or like not paying attention to others, or like not paying attention to yourself, and really just like kind of just like, okay, we're just going to do whatever we can to get us out of this uncomfiness. And in a way, that's an incredible thing because it can protect us. Our ego can be really protective. Our ego can protect us from scenarios that are dangerous. If you're in a dangerous situation and your body is saying, okay, red alert, like let's not do this right now, your ego kicks in and it helps you use your resources to protect yourself. So your ego is not inherently this terrible thing, but most of the time, our egos don't know the difference between good stress and bad stress. So when you're experiencing good stress, your ego might still kick in because it's worried that we're in danger, even though we're not. Good stress, like transitions, like challenging yourself, like trying to, understand who you are. Like it's uncomfortable to be questioning yourself, to be trying to understand who you are inside, all of that. And that's when the ego might kick in. Or even if someone else is, challenging you or something like that, like that's when the ego might kick in because you're uncomfortable. And in a way, I say thank your ego for that. Like to be like, okay, thank you brain, thank you mind, thank you ego for trying to protect me. But like, I'm okay. I don't need it right now. And sometimes even just like talking to myself like that is a way for me to kind of be like, okay, I'm going to recognize what's going on right now. I am feeling this fight or flight response, and I'm going to, really state that out loud so I know, and then I'm going to shift my mindset on that a little bit. So let's differentiate the ego versus things like your soul or your higher self, some people call it, or your intuition or anything like that. The different ways that, because sometimes it's hard to tell, like, is this my ego talking or is this something else talking? So I wrote down a few things that tend to be habits of the ego and tend to be habits of the soul or your higher energy. So I wanted to go through that a little bit. Habits of the ego tend to be things like caring what other people think. So when we think of someone who, maybe we think of like someone who has a big ego or something, we actually sometimes think that they don't care what others think. And a lot of times the ego actually really does care what other people think. And that is why there's that fight or flight response, because it's like, hey, I want someone to, I don't want people to think that I am weak. So I'm going to stand up or something like that, right? So a lot of times the ego really actually does care what other people think a lot. And it's trying to protect themselves from causing people to think other things, and it usually ends up backfiring, but that is something that the ego tends to do. Another thing that is very similar to this is people pleasing. I used to be a really big people pleaser. I honestly don't feel like I am anymore. I really don't have a problem saying no, and I'm not quite sure. I mean, I did a lot of working on it to fix that, and I'm sure I have posts on it and everything, and I'd really like to sit down and really do an episode on it, but there's not like one quick thing that I can say that really changed it for me. And the biggest thing was just my mindset. Like, I just needed to really just reprogram my mind. So I used to be a really big people pleaser, and people pleasing is a habit of your ego. And I'm not saying like, okay, I know we're all people pleasers, right? Like, I still have my moments, right? And I'm not saying, oh my gosh, you're a people pleaser, you have a huge ego. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying here. Again, I want to differentiate ego in what we usually think of as someone who has a big ego, and ego in terms of what I'm thinking of here. I'm thinking of ego as purely, it's your body's fight or flight response. Like, we're giving it love and we're being grateful for it, and then choosing to do our own thing despite that, right? And like, people pleasing is something where you are trying to protect yourself. Again, it's protecting yourself from what others think. If you're afraid to, do what you need to do for yourself and instead do something for someone else and it's hurting you, why are you doing that? Because it's uncomfortable to say no. So people pleasing is something that can lead to to some issues with your ego, or it can lead to just some temptations there, I guess, if you want to say. As someone who used to people please a lot, I do think that it is a habit of, not really being in tune with yourself as much. Or it's, how do I word this? It's not that you're not in tune with yourself, it's that saying no is hard. Saying no is really, really hard. And the reason why it's hard is because naturally our mind and our bodies want to protect ourselves from what other people think. And that does not need to be what you do, right? That is a way of protecting ourselves. And that is a moment where you can say, hey, I really appreciate this mind, but I'm gonna do my best to not people please in this moment. It's a whole thing. I would love to do an episode on it. Anyways, let's get to the next one. Another one, negativity, blaming people, and having bad habits are all habits of the ego, and I'm not even going to get into those ones because I think those ones are pretty obvious right there. Competing, wanting to be the best, making excuses. Again, you just don't want to feel uncomfortable. I get it, because I have an ego too. Not acknowledging your flaws is a big one that I think by being the best you can be does not mean that you ignore any of your other issues. It means that you find your issues, you find your flaws, you find the things you should work on, and you work on them. And you recognize your flaws and you love yourself despite it. That's a big one that I really struggled with. And then finally, not letting go, which is another one that I have definitely struggled with in my life. We aren't comfortable by change. Change does not make us feel great. And so a way that the ego kind of tries to protect us a little bit is by not letting go of things that you need to let go of. I have definitely struggled with this. I definitely felt the pain that came with this. I am so happy that I've been able to let go of these things now, and I wish it had taken less time. And that is something that, to ask yourself, am I not letting go of this because I truly believe that it is good for me, or is it because I am afraid of change? So now we know kind of some of the habits of the ego, but some of the habits of the soul or a higher energy can help us, like just recognizing these habits can help us kind of shift it a little bit. So things that some people, it doesn't, having an ego can make people mad, right? But also following your heart, your soul, your higher self can also make people mad. So these are all it's hard sometimes, at least for me, to differentiate between, is this coming out of a good place or a bad place, right? And it's really where I have to ask myself of why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I am truly believing it is going to make me a better person and it is good for me? Or am I doing it for me because I want to, or because I'm scared, or something like that? And so some of the habits of the higher self or the soul include following your intuition, letting go, being able to listen to yourself, being able to celebrate others and be happy for others, being able to practice gratitude, doing your best to always be growing, doing your best to embrace mindset shifts, doing your best to stay true to yourself instead of taking care of others or pleasing others if it's hurting you, and being able to take responsibility for things. And all of these things, I don't truly think that it's black and white. There is no just ego, just higher self, soul, whatever. I need to come up with a better way to explain this. But I don't think that there is just one or the other. I think that they work together. And you can be doing your best to be listening to this positive energy while still falling into the habits of the ego. It's not just yes and no. It's almost like a constant battle between the two. I do my best to celebrate other people, but sometimes I'm just not happy. Maybe someone got the job that I wanted, and I do my best to celebrate, but sometimes it's just oh, I'm really bummed, and that's okay. That's not wrong. That's natural human instinct. And it's the way you respond to those emotions that can be how you how you respond can shape which one of those two you end up falling into. Are you going to fall into the higher energy, or are you going to fall into the ego? And falling into the ego is so easy. So my point here is just that, like, I'm giving this information as to kind of redefining the ego a little bit, or just like things about the ego that can help us recognize it a little bit more. But it doesn't mean, okay, ego, no more of that, right? Like I already said, your ego can protect you. It can be a great thing. And it also can be a thing that is not good for you. It can hurt you, and it can cause difficult situations. So this whole thing is just to really recognize all of this and be able to just understand the way that your mind works a little bit more, be able to understand the way that you want to be connecting to your soul, or connecting to who you are, finding yourself, all of these different things. So give yourself as much grace as you possibly can. Give yourself the chance to just be kind to yourself, because ultimately that is what I do believe is the best way to combat those bad habits or ego tendencies, is to really take care of yourself, to really find yourself, to really connect with your soul, who you are, and just take a deep breath and breathe and be grateful and all of these different things. So I hope that this episode is interesting. It makes sense to people. If it doesn't, let me know. I'm very happy to clarify more, and I'll see you next time.